The streets of Monrovia have spoken, and their voice echoes across the Atlantic, carrying the weight of centuries of struggle for genuine African sovereignty. When hundreds of Liberians flooded their capital's thoroughfares this Thursday, chanting, "Enough is enough," they weren't merely protesting a politician's broken promises, they were asserting their fundamental right as Africans to hold their leaders accountable, to demand justice, and to shape their own destiny without interference from foreign powers or corrupt local elites. This is the story of how Africa's oldest republic is reclaiming its revolutionary legacy, and why this moment in Monrovia represents something far more significant than a typical political demonstration. This is about the soul of African democracy itself. To understand the profound significance of these protests, we must first appreciate Liberia's unique position in the African political landscape. Founded in 1847 by freed American slaves, Liberia holds the distinction of being Africa's oldest republic and one of only two African nations never to have been fully colonized by European powers. This historical reality imbues every political movement in Liberia with deep symbolic resonance for the broader African continent. Yet Liberia's journey toward authentic sovereignty has been anything but smooth. The nation endured one of Africa's most devastating civil wars from 1989 to 2003, a conflict that claimed over 250,000 lives and displaced millions. The war's brutality, characterized by the use of child soldiers and systematic atrocities, left scars that continue to shape Liberian society today. Figures like Charles Taylor, Prince Johnson, and the notorious Joshua Blahi, infamously known as General Butt Naked, became symbols of how power divorced from accountability can destroy the very fabric of African societies. When Joseph Boakai assumed the presidency in January 2024, many Liberians hoped his 4 decades of public service experience would translate into the steady, principled leadership their nation desperately needed. His victory over George Weah represented more than a simple change of administration. It embodied the Liberian people's aspiration for governance that would prioritize their welfare over personal enrichment or foreign interests. The demonstrations we witnessed in Monrovia exemplify the sophisticated political consciousness that characterizes modern African civil society. These weren't spontaneous eruptions of anger, but carefully orchestrated expressions of democratic will. Led by opposition figure Mulba Morlu, the protesters articulated specific, measurable demands that reflect a mature understanding of governance and accountability. Victoria Roberts, the businesswoman whose words captured the frustration of many, didn't simply complain about hardship, she challenged the fundamental contradiction between campaign promises and governing reality. Her pointed question, "How can you say that you came to better the lives of the people, but then you came and took people from jobs?" cuts to the heart of political accountability in the African context. This level of civic engagement reflects the intellectual heritage of African societies that have always valued deliberative democracy, from the Ubuntu philosophy of Southern Africa to the palaver systems of West Africa. These traditions emphasize collective decision-making, consensus building, and the right of communities to question their leaders, values that colonial powers systematically suppressed but could never fully eradicate. The protesters' grievances extend far beyond political rhetoric to touch the fundamental economic challenges facing post-conflict African societies. When demonstrators denounced politically motivated firings, they highlighted a crucial aspect of genuine sovereignty, the right of African peoples to economic security and opportunity within their own nations. Liberia's economy, like many African economies, remains heavily dependent on natural resource extraction, iron ore, rubber, and timber, with limited value-added processing. This structural vulnerability makes the country susceptible to external shocks and perpetuates patterns of economic dependency that echo colonial relationships. When President Boakai's government fails to create jobs or improve living conditions, it's not merely a domestic policy failure, it's a failure to advance the economic sovereignty that is essential for genuine independence. The protesters' demands for accountability reflect their understanding that economic development cannot be separated from good governance. African nations have witnessed too many leaders who enriched themselves while their people suffered, often with the tacit or explicit support of foreign powers more interested in resource extraction than genuine development. Perhaps the most significant demand emerging from these protests is the call for a war crimes tribunal to address atrocities committed during Liberia's civil wars. This demand represents a profound assertion of African agency in defining justice and accountability. Rather than accepting impunity as an inevitable feature of African politics, the protesters are demanding that their society confront its traumatic past through legitimate judicial processes. The specific mention of figures like Prince Johnson and General Butt Naked demonstrates the protesters' sophisticated understanding of transitional justice. They recognize that true reconciliation cannot occur without accountability, and that a society that fails to address past atrocities remains vulnerable to their repetition. This perspective aligns with the broader African Renaissance movement that emphasizes the need for African societies to develop their own mechanisms for conflict resolution and justice. The protesters' call for a war crimes court also represents a rejection of the selective justice that has characterized many international interventions in Africa. They are demanding comprehensive accountability, not the politically motivated prosecution of convenient scapegoats. This demand reflects a mature understanding that justice must be both thorough and impartial to be legitimate. These protests in Monrovia occur within a broader context of African political awakening that has seen similar movements from Senegal to Kenya, from Ghana to South Africa. The common thread connecting these diverse movements is a growing rejection of governance that serves external interests at the expense of African people's welfare. Liberia's strategic position on the West African coast, combined with its historical ties to the United States, makes these protests particularly significant for regional stability. The country serves as a potential model for how African nations can navigate the complex terrain of international relations while maintaining their sovereignty and dignity. The protesters' sophisticated articulation of their demands sends a clear message to both domestic and international observers. African peoples will no longer accept leaders who govern as proxies for foreign interests or who treat public office as personal enrichment opportunities. This represents a maturation of African political consciousness that threatens the comfortable arrangements that have long characterized Western relationships with African governments. While the protests included Liberians of all ages, the energy and organization behind them reflect the growing political consciousness of African youth. This generation, educated and connected to global information networks, refuses to accept the low expectations that previous generations were often forced to accommodate. The motorcyclists' specific demands for a war crimes court illustrate how ordinary working people have become sophisticated political actors. They understand that their economic struggles are connected to broader questions of governance and justice, and they demand comprehensive solutions rather than superficial reforms. This youth-led political consciousness represents perhaps the most significant threat to the neo-colonial arrangements that have long characterized African politics. Unlike previous generations who may have been more deferential to authority, these young Africans view good governance as their birthright, not a privilege to be granted by benevolent leaders. The international media's coverage of these protests will likely follow predictable patterns, focusing on instability and conflict rather than the sophisticated democratic expression they represent. Western media outlets have consistently struggled to present African political movements as legitimate expressions of democratic will, preferring narratives that emphasize chaos and incapacity. This media bias reflects deeper assumptions about African political capacity that these protesters directly challenge. Their articulate demands, peaceful methods, and clear vision for their society contradict stereotypes about African political engagement and demonstrate the intellectual sophistication that characterizes modern African civil society. The protesters' actions serve as a powerful reminder that African peoples are fully capable of diagnosing their society's problems and prescribing appropriate solutions. They don't need external validation or guidance. They need leaders who will respect their intelligence and serve their interests. The Liberian protests resonate across the African continent because they address challenges that transcend national boundaries. The demand for accountability, economic opportunity, and justice reflects aspirations shared by African peoples from Cairo to Cape Town, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. The protesters' sophisticated articulation of their grievances contributes to a growing Pan-African consensus that authentic sovereignty requires more than formal independence. It demands governance that serves African interests and respects African dignity. This perspective challenges both domestic leaders who have betrayed their people's trust and international partners who have enabled such betrayals. The success or failure of these protests will send signals across the continent about the possibilities for peaceful democratic change. If President Boakai responds positively to the protesters' demands, it could inspire similar movements elsewhere. If he ignores or represses them, it will likely strengthen arguments for more radical approaches to political change. The protesters in Monrovia have articulated a clear vision for their society: accountable leadership, economic opportunity, and justice for past atrocities. Their demands are neither unreasonable nor impossible to achieve. They simply require leaders who prioritize their people's welfare over personal or foreign interests. President Boakai's response to these protests will define his legacy and potentially determine Liberia's political trajectory for years to come. If he embraces the protesters' demands and demonstrates genuine commitment to reform, he could position himself as a transformative leader who helped restore Liberia's position as a beacon of African democratic possibility. If, however, he continues to ignore these legitimate grievances or responds with repression, he will join the ranks of African leaders who squandered their people's trust and undermined their nation's sovereignty. The protesters have made clear that they will not accept empty promises or cosmetic reforms. They demand substantive change that addresses the root causes of their frustrations. The protests in Monrovia represent more than a domestic political dispute. They embody the ongoing struggle for authentic African sovereignty that has characterized the continent's politics since independence. The demonstrators' sophisticated demands, peaceful methods, and clear vision for their society reflect the intellectual maturity and political consciousness that define modern African civil society. These Liberians have reminded the world that African peoples are the ultimate arbiters of their own political destiny. They have demonstrated that respect for African agency requires more than rhetorical acknowledgement. It demands concrete support for African people's right to hold their leaders accountable and shape their own futures. The international community's response to these protests will reveal much about the sincerity of stated commitments to African development and democracy. Supporting these protesters means supporting their right to accountable governance, economic opportunity, and justice, not merely expressing concern about stability or offering technical assistance. The streets of Monrovia have spoken with a voice that echoes across the Atlantic and throughout the African continent. They have declared that the era of accepting substandard governance in the name of stability or development is over. They have asserted their right to leaders who serve African interests and respect African dignity. This is the African Renaissance in action, not as a distant aspiration, but as a lived reality being created by ordinary people who refuse to accept extraordinary suffering as their permanent condition. The protesters in Monrovia have added their voices to the growing chorus of African peoples demanding authentic sovereignty, and their message deserves to be heard, understood, and supported by all who genuinely believe in African potential. If you believe in supporting genuine African sovereignty and the right of African peoples to determine their own political future, I urge you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps amplify these critical voices and ensures that authentic African perspectives reach wider audiences. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our coverage of Africa's ongoing struggle for genuine independence and self-determination. Share this video with others who need to understand that African political movements represent sophisticated expressions of democratic will, not the chaos and instability that mainstream media often portrays. Every like, every share, every subscription is a vote for African agency and a rejection of the narratives that diminish African political capacity. Join us in celebrating the wisdom, courage, and determination of African peoples as they work to build societies that serve their interests and honor their dignity. The future of African sovereignty depends on informed global citizens who understand and support these legitimate aspirations for accountable governance and genuine independence.